On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 took off from Kuala Lumpur, carrying 239 souls toward Beijing. Modern Boeing 777. Experienced crew. Perfect weather. Routine overnight flight. Nothing suggested this aircraft would become aviation's greatest unsolved mystery. 40 minutes later, it vanished. For decades, commercial aviation has been the safest form of transportation. Every crash investigated. Every black box recovered. Every accident explained. Families receive answers. Regulations improve. The system learns from tragedy. Then MH370 shattered that certainty. It proved a Boeing 777 can simply disappear. This is not a story about mechanical failure or pilot error. This is about something far more disturbing. 7 hours of intentional flight. Deliberate system shutdowns. Calculated turns. Silent disappearance. And a truth so uncomfortable that governments released partial data and redacted reports. What really happened that night? At 1:19 a.m. the final routine message transmitted. Good night Malaysian370.com voice. No distress. No emergency code. Seconds later the transponder manually switched off. The plane did not crash, it went silent. And that silence lasted 7 hours, while it flew across the Indian Ocean. Military radar revealed something chilling. The aircraft did not continue toward Beijing. Instead, it executed a sharp turn back across the Malay Peninsula, flying westward, climbing, descending, following waypoints. This required deliberate human input. Someone was flying MH370, with precision and purpose. But toward what destination? One by one, communication systems were disabled. A car's data link stopped. Transponder went dark. Yet engines continued producing thrust. Control surfaces responded normally. The aircraft remained fully operational. Whoever controlled MH370 knew exactly how to keep it airborne while making it invisible to civilian radar. Satellite handshake data confirmed the Boeing continued flying for approximately 7 hours after disappearing from radar. Each automated ping between aircraft and Inmarsat satellite proved continued flight, but revealed nothing about altitude, speed, or direction. The plane was alive and flying. But where? Inside the cockpit, something fundamental had changed. Investigators concluded the actions taken could not have been accidental. Disabling multiple systems, altering flight path, maintaining stable flight. This pointed overwhelmingly toward human intervention. But identifying intent proved far more difficult than identifying capability. Attention focused immediately on the captain. Highly experienced pilot. Over 18,000 flight hours. Respected professional. But investigators found something deeply unsettling. A flight simulator at his home contained practice routes eerily similar to MH370 final path. Routes into the southern Indian Ocean. Routes to nowhere. The co-pilot showed no behavioral red flags. Younger, less experienced. No history of instability. Cabin crew never reported anything unusual. Passengers never sent distress messages. Whatever occurred in the cockpit happened quickly, quietly, and without triggering panic in the cabin or alerting the world. The investigation into the captain became more invasive and more troubling with each passing week. Forensic experts examined his personal computer and discovered he had deleted files from his flight simulator just weeks before the flight. Data recovery specialists worked to reconstruct those deleted flight paths, and what they found sent chills through the investigative team. The simulated routes showed flights that deviated from normal corridors turned back over Malaysia, and then continued south into the remote Indian Ocean until fuel was exhausted. These were not casual flight plans. These were rehearsals for a very specific kind of disappearance. The routes matched almost perfectly, with the satellite data tracking MH370's final known trajectory. It was as if someone had practiced making a Boeing 777 vanish without a trace, and then executed that plan with terrifying precision. But simulation data alone does not prove intent. Pilots often experiment with unusual flight scenarios for training purposes or simple curiosity. Defense experts argued that the deleted files could represent innocent exploration of theoretical emergency situations. Perhaps he was testing how far the aircraft could fly on one engine. Perhaps he was curious about remote Indian Ocean navigation. Without a confession, without a suicide note, without any direct evidence of motive, the simulation discovery remained circumstantial. Disturbing, yes, but not conclusive. Investigators were left with a pattern of behavior that suggested premeditation, but could not definitively prove it. The captain had no known financial troubles. No apparent mental health crisis. No farewell messages to loved ones. His life appeared stable and unremarkable right up until the night MH370 disappeared. This absence of obvious motive made the case even more unsettling because it suggested that if this was indeed deliberate, it was carried out by someone who left no psychological trail to follow. The search for MH370 became the most expensive aviation search in history. Ships, aircraft, and underwater autonomous vehicles scoured vast expanses of the southern Indian Ocean, one of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth. The search zone covered over 120,000 square kilometers of seabed in waters up to 6,000 meters deep. Sonar mapping revealed underwater mountains, trenches, and volcanic ridges that had never been charted before. Yet, despite years of effort and billions of dollars spent, the main wreckage remained hidden. Floating debris eventually washed ashore on coastlines thousands of kilometers away. A flaperon found on Reunion Island. Wing fragments on African beaches. Each piece confirmed the aircraft had impacted the ocean, but provided no insight into why or exactly where. The debris field suggested a high-energy impact, but without the flight recorders, there was no way to reconstruct the final moments. No voices, no alarms. No data showing whether the aircraft was under human control or in a death spiral when it hit the water. The Malaysian government faced unprecedented pressure to release information. But their responses only deepened public suspicion and frustration. Initial press conferences contradicted each other. Timelines shifted. Radar data was released in fragments. Some information was classified for national security reasons. Other details were delayed, corrected, or quietly walked back. Families were left to navigate a bureaucratic maze where even basic facts were treated as sensitive information. This culture of secrecy, whether justified by security concerns or motivated by political embarrassment, ensured that the full story of MH370 would remain elusive even if wreckage were someday recovered. Conspiracy theories proliferated in the information vacuum. Some claimed the aircraft was remotely hijacked by state actors. Others suggested it was shot down by military forces during a training exercise gone wrong. There were theories about hidden cargoes of lithium batteries or valuable materials that someone wanted to steal or destroy. Military radar tracked the aircraft over the Malay Peninsula, but showed no signs of interception or engagement. The most disturbing conclusion remained the simplest. Someone inside the cockpit deliberately diverted the aircraft and flew it until it could fly no more. Technical analysis of the satellite data provided the clearest picture of MH370's final hours, but also highlighted the limitations of aviation tracking systems in 2014. The Inmarsat satellite recorded automated handshakes with the aircraft at regular intervals, essentially digital pings, confirming the plane was powered and communicating. The satellite was never designed for precision tracking. It was a communications relay, not a GPS tracker. The calculations involved complex mathematical models and assumptions about aircraft performance. Different teams of experts analyzed the same data and arrived at slightly different conclusions about the final resting place. This uncertainty meant the search area remained enormous, even after years of refinement, and multiple search campaigns failed to locate the wreckage despite high-confidence predictions. The psychological impact of MH370 extended far beyond the families of the victims. Frequent flyers confronted the uncomfortable reality that modern aviation, despite all its redundancies and safety protocols, still depended fundamentally on human operators who could disable safeguards if they chose to. The flying public had grown accustomed to viewing air travel as a highly automated, low-risk activity, where computers and procedures minimized human error. MH370 shattered that illusion. It demonstrated that a determined individual with cockpit access could render an aircraft nearly invisible, disconnect communication systems, and divert from its flight plan without triggering immediate intervention. The absence of physical evidence created a unique form of suffering for the families of the 239 victims. In most aviation disasters, there is wreckage. There are remains. There is a crash site where loved ones can visit and grieve. There is finality. MH370 offered none of that. Families were left in a state of suspended grief, unable to fully process loss. Because loss itself remained unproven in the most literal sense. Without bodies, there could be no burials. Without a crash site, there could be no memorials at the actual location of tragedy. Some families clung to hope that their loved ones might still be alive somewhere, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Others demanded continued search efforts, long after official operations were suspended. International relations were strained by the handling of the investigation and search efforts. Malaysia accused of incompetence and cover-ups. Australia bearing the financial and logistical burden of the underwater search. China, frustrated by lack of transparency regarding its citizens who made up the majority of passengers. the United States providing technical assistance, but withholding classified intelligence. Each nation had its own interests and its own version of events. Diplomatic tensions simmered beneath the surface of official cooperation. Leaked documents suggested that some governments knew more than they publicly acknowledged. Radar data that could have clarified the flight path was initially withheld or misrepresented. Search zones were defined based on incomplete information. Families accused governments of prioritizing political considerations over truth and accountability. The result was an investigation that, despite involving some of the world's best aviation experts and most advanced technology, never achieved the transparency or completeness that such a tragedy demanded. Debris recovery provided tantalizing clues, but frustratingly little insight into the final moments of the flight. The flaperon found on Reunion Island showed damage consistent with a high-speed water impact, but forensic analysis could not determine whether the flaps were deployed or retracted at the time of impact, a crucial detail that would indicate whether someone was attempting a controlled ditching or whether the aircraft was in an uncontrolled descent. Currents shifted seasonally. The randomness of what floated and what sank made it impossible to work backward from debris locations to a precise crash site. The role of mental health in aviation safety became a focal point of discussion after MH370. If the captain had indeed deliberately diverted the aircraft, what warning signs, if any, had been missed? Pilots undergo medical examinations, but psychological screening is often minimal and easily circumvented by anyone determined to hide their intentions. The aviation industry has long struggled with the stigma around mental health. Pilots fear that reporting depression, anxiety, or personal crises could result in loss of their medical certificate, and by extension, their career and livelihood. This creates perverse incentives for pilots to suffer in silence rather than seek help. The Germanwings tragedy, just 1 year after MH370, in which a co-pilot deliberately crashed an Airbus A320 into the French Alps, reinforced these concerns. Both incidents involved pilots who appeared outwardly functional, but who may have been experiencing private psychological crises that led to catastrophic decisions. Aviation authorities worldwide implemented reforms, including requirements for more frequent psychological evaluations and peer support programs, but the fundamental tension remains how to encourage openness about mental health, while maintaining rigorous safety standards. Technology has advanced significantly since 2014, but the core vulnerability exposed by MH370 remains. Modern aircraft are now equipped with systems that make them harder to disable and easier to track. The fundamental problem is that pilots by necessity must have significant control over aircraft systems. They need to be able to respond to emergencies, disable malfunctioning equipment, and make critical decisions without waiting for authorization from the ground. This autonomy, which is essential for flight safety, also creates opportunities for misuse. There is no perfect technological solution to the threat posed by a trusted insider who decides to weaponize their authority. The search for MH370 officially ended in 2018 after 4 years of effort, but private expeditions and independent researchers have continued. Ocean Infinity, a marine robotics company, conducted a privately funded search in 2018 covering additional areas of seabed, but found nothing. Theories about the crash location continue to evolve as researchers reanalyze satellite data and drift patterns. Some experts believe the aircraft is outside the primary search zone, perhaps further north, or at a different depth than originally estimated. The Titanic lay undiscovered for 73 years. Air France Flight 447 took 2 years to find, despite a known crash location. MH370 could remain hidden for decades, or potentially forever, if it came to rest in an area of extreme depth, complex terrain, or under conditions that degrade wreckage beyond recognition. What makes MH370 uniquely terrifying is not simply that it disappeared, but that it did so while fully operational. The aircraft did not suffer a catastrophic failure. It did not explode. It did not encounter severe weather. It functioned exactly as designed for over 7 hours after its last known position. This was not a story of technology failing humanity, but of humanity failing technology. The systems worked. The safeguards operated as intended. But none of that mattered when someone with authority decided to use that technology for purposes it was never meant to serve. MH370 demonstrated that the greatest threats to modern systems are not always external. Sometimes the most dangerous failures occur when everything works exactly as designed, and humans decide how it will be used. The aircraft became a tool for an act that remains incomprehensible, not because we lack the technical capability to understand aviation, but because we lack the psychological framework to understand why someone would choose to carry 238 innocent people to their deaths while erasing their own existence from the world. The legacy of MH370 is one of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. A decade later, families still gather on anniversaries, demanding that governments renew search efforts. They have formed advocacy groups, lobbied politicians, and raised private funds to keep the search alive. Their persistence is driven not by denial, but by a fundamental human need for answers, for closure, for the simple dignity of knowing where their loved ones rest. Some family members have devoted their lives to this cause, leaving careers behind to become full-time advocates. Others have retreated into private mourning, unable to engage with a world that has largely moved on. The psychological toll is immeasurable. Studies of families affected by ambiguous loss situations, where a loved one is missing but not confirmed dead, show elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and complicated grief that can last for decades. MH370 families live in this limbo, unable to fully grieve because grief requires acceptance and acceptance requires knowing. The question that haunts everyone who studies MH370 is why. If this was indeed a deliberate act, what possible motive could justify or even explain such horror? Financial gain seems implausible, as there was no ransom demand or theft. Political terrorism appears unlikely given the absence of any claim of responsibility or coherent message. Personal revenge makes no sense, as passengers were randomly selected travelers with no obvious connection to any individual. The most chilling possibility is that there was no external motive at all, that this was an act of self-destruction, expanded to include 238 strangers. A final assertion of control by someone who felt powerless in life. If true, it would make MH370 one of the largest murder-suicides in history, carried out with a vehicle that gave the perpetrator 7 hours of uninterrupted flight to contemplate what they had done, and still they did not turn back. This interpretation is supported by the evidence, but can never be proven without a confession or definitive forensic proof, and both are likely lost forever at the bottom of the ocean. Aviation will never be the same after MH370. The industry prides itself on learning from every accident, on implementing changes that prevent similar tragedies in the future. But how do you prevent something that relies not on fixing a mechanical flaw or updating a procedure, but on reading the mind of a trusted professional? Background checks cannot predict future intentions. The industry can add safeguards, redundancies, and oversight, but at the core of every flight is a human being in control of a machine, capable of traveling hundreds of miles per hour at 40,000 feet. We entrust them with our lives, and almost always that trust is justified. But MH370 is the exception that proves how fragile that trust truly is. Until the ocean yields its final secrets, the full truth of MH370 will remain beyond reach. Perhaps one day fishing nets will snag wreckage. Perhaps advancing underwater technology will finally locate the debris field. Perhaps a deathbed confession will emerge, though none of the pilots' families have suggested they possessed guilty knowledge. Or perhaps the mystery will endure indefinitely, joining the ranks of historical enigmas that haunt us precisely because they cannot be solved. The Boeing 777 and everyone aboard became ghosts, not in the supernatural sense, but in the literal sense, vanished from the world, without leaving behind the evidence needed to understand their fate. Somewhere in the darkness of the southern Indian Ocean lies the answer. Metal and memory scattered across the seabed, waiting for someone to find them. But the ocean is vast and indifferent. It keeps its secrets well. And MH370 may be one secret it never surrenders.